Thank you. Good evening and thanks for coming. So the talk today, it's called The Doctor and the Saint. And I'm going to try and talk about a conflict between two men, and through that conflict to try and look at colonialism, imperialism, race and caste in a way that I think might complicate the way we usually understand it. The doctor is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I think perhaps a lot of you may not have heard of him. In India, certainly, he is a very, very beloved figure, particularly amongst the Dalits, the people who are formerly known as untouchables. Of course, untouchables not in the Hollywood sense, but in the opposite sense, you know, people right at the bottom of the caste ladder. And the saint, it's a word that I use ironically in the title, and the saint is a person, I think, who is beloved to many of you, Mahatma Gandhi. And sadly, some of the things that I will say today will, and I think should, call his greatness into question. And I know this is going to be distressing for many, and let me say it was distressing for me too, because I was also brought up, conditioned on this, well, what can I say, but misrepresentation of history, or even that is a polite word. The conflict between them, of course, began a long time ago, but it really came head to head in the 1930s, at the time when India was still a British colony. But Ambedkar was really Gandhi's nemesis. You know, he challenged him intellectually, he challenged him politically, but he also challenged him morally. And the reason that he has been left out of the kind of master narrative of Indian history is because of this, you know. And it's not that he's left out in the sense that he is somebody who obviously children learn about in school, but he was a man who left a complicated legacy. He was a revolutionary, he was a newspaper editor, he was a politician, and eventually he actually helped in the drafting of the Indian Constitution. But the way he is valorized in our history books or in our lives generally, not among the Dalit people but amongst the privileged castes and by the state and the establishment, is as the leader of the establishment, or the man who kind of wrote the Indian Constitution. He didn't write it, he was the chairman of the drafting committee, and he was very unhappy with the Constitution when it came out. But in some way they leave out the passion, the rage and the anger that drove Dr. Ambedkar, and this was a fight against caste. So the Annihilation of Caste actually is the text of a speech that he never delivered. It was written in 1936, and he was invited by a sort of Hindu reformist privileged caste organization called the Jat Pat Todak Mandal, which means an organization for the destruction of caste, or for the breakup of caste, let's say. And he gave in this text in advance because he asked him to. And when they read it and they realized that he was going to use their platform to denounce the sacred texts of Hinduism and to call upon untouchables, as they were called in those days, to renounce Hinduism and embrace any other religion that does not discriminate against human beings in this way, they cancelled, the invitation to him was cancelled. So then he published The Annihilation of Caste as a text. And the man who we know as the greatest Hindu of all time, Mahatma Gandhi, responded, and Ambedkar responded to that response. And that is the main text of this book. Annihilation of Caste as a text has been available. It's a kind of underground legend, and yet very few people in the establishment read it because it isn't available. It is the Dalits who have kept it in print. But this is the first time that it's been extensively annotated so that you can see the reference that, many times he makes references to incidents which then people would have known about, but today people don't know what it's about. So it's an extensively annotated edition. And of course, my introduction to it is called The Doctor and the Saint. It's an almost book-length introduction. Of course, many have said, you should have published it as a separate book. If it had been published as a separate book in India, I'm pretty sure it would have been banned or disappeared in some way. So it was a bit of a Trojan horse operation. So now, before I get into the whole debate between these two streams of thought, I just want to read out a little bit for those of you who, caste is something that the outside world has felt nervous of engaging with because it's just associated with Gandhi and yoga and backpacks and mysticism and the Beatles and so on. So I want to explain to those of you who are not aware of what caste is. I'm just going to read out a little bit. Anthropologists will debate the origins of caste for years to come, but its organizing principles based on a hierarchical sliding scale of entitlements and duties, of purity and pollution, and in the ways in which they were and still are policed and enforced, are not all that hard to understand. The people at the top of the caste pyramid, the Brahmins, are considered pure and have plenty of entitlements. And those at the bottom are considered polluted and have few entitlements but plenty of duties. And the pollution-purity matrix is correlated to an elaborate system of caste-based ancestral occupation. So there isn't any single caste that is equal to another caste. It's a very clear hierarchy. However complicated it is, a very clear hierarchy. What we call the caste system today is known in Hinduism's founding texts as Varnashram Dharma, or Chaturvarna, the system of 4 varnas, approximately 4,000 endogamous castes and subcastes, which are called jatis, in Hindu society, each with its own specified hereditary occupation, are divided into 4 varnas. The Brahmins, who are the priests, who are about 6% of the population, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the Vaishyas, the Baniyas as they are called, who are the traders, who are less than 3%, and this is the caste to which Gandhi belonged, and the Shudras, who are the servants. And outside of these varnas are the Ati Shudras, the subhumans, arranged in hierarchies of their own, the untouchables, the unseeables, the unapproachables, whose presence, whose touch, whose very shadow is considered polluting by privileged caste Hindus. Today, just amongst these untouchable castes, there could be like 100 or more than 100 subcastes, and even they are arranged in a hierarchy. And today, about 100 million people, which is 1/3 of the population of the United States, counts as untouchable. Each region of India has lovingly perfected its own unique version of caste-based cruelty, based on an unwritten code that's much worse. Much worse, I say, not because I want to compare horrors, but the only reason I'm saying worse than racism is because it's sanctioned in the scriptures. It is said to have religious sanction, which is such an immutable thing in some ways. Other than being forced to live in segregated settlements, untouchables were not allowed to use the public roads that privileged castes used. They were not allowed to drink from common wells. They were not allowed into Hindu temples. They were not allowed into privileged caste schools. They were not permitted to cover their upper bodies. They were only allowed to wear certain kinds of clothes and certain kind of jewelry. Some castes, like the Mahars, the caste to which Baba Sahib Ambedkar belonged, had to tie brooms to their waist that would sweep away their polluting footprints, and others had to hang spittoons around their necks to collect polluted saliva. Men of the privileged caste had undisputed rights over the bodies of untouchable women. Love is polluting, but rape is pure. In many parts of India, all this continues to this day. What remains to be said about an imagination, human or divine, that has thought up an arrangement such as this? Ambedkar called Hinduism a chamber of horrors. For the untouchables, he said, it's a chamber of horrors. And here I quote him. He says, there cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than the caste system. It is a system that deadens, paralyzes, and cripples people from helpful activity. The most famous Indian in the world, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, disagreed. He believed that caste represented the genius of Indian society. In 1921, in his Gujarati journal Navajivan, he wrote, and I quote, I believe that if Hindu society has been able to stand, it is because it is founded on the caste system. To destroy caste and adopt the Western European social system means Hindus must give up the principle of hereditary occupation, which is the soul of caste. So by this he means that the caste whose divinely ordained operation is to clean other people's shit should continue to do that. The Brahmin should remain the Brahmin, and so on. Hereditary principle is an eternal principle. I continue to quote Gandhi. To change it is to create disorder. I have no use for a Brahmin if I cannot call him a Brahmin for my life. It will be chaos if every day a Brahmin is changed into a Shudra, and a Shudra is changed into a Brahmin. Now, of course, the contention is that Gandhi changed his mind later on. He didn't really. Right to the end of his days, he believed in Varnashram Dharma. He said, okay, maybe the many castes should be fused into the 4 Varnas. Now, why is it that people in the world, I guess most people in the world know about Gandhi through Richard Attenborough's film, which was really a terrible distortion of history, in which Ambedkar didn't even have a walk-on part, And the reason that people associate Gandhi as a person who was a warrior against caste was because, like many Hindu reformers, and I'll come to this in a while, he campaigned against untouchability, which was the performative end of caste, but actually caste is about entitlement. Caste is about your access to resources. Caste is about your right to study. Caste is about your access to water and land. These things Gandhi never questioned. But in order to maintain the status quo, he began to campaign against untouchability as being wrong. And I'll get into this in a while. So other contemporary abominations like apartheid, racism, sexism, economic imperialism, and religious fundamentalism have been politically and intellectually challenged at international forums. Of course, they have not been defeated. And of course, racism and apartheid and all these things continue to exist in newer and slyer ways. But how is it that the practice of caste in India, this most brutal mode of hierarchical social organization that human society has known, has managed to escape scrutiny? And how is it that one of its most ardent supporters has come to be seen as the saint of the modern world, a sort of modern-day Christ? Perhaps because caste is associated with mysticism and yoga and vegetarianism, and also because, unlike racism and apartheid, caste is not color-coded and isn't easy to see. So even today you have Indian intellectuals who support caste and say, this is the glue that holds Indian society together. Caste is not the same as race, but casteism and racism are both forms of discrimination that target people because of their descent. To support caste is very much like supporting racism or apartheid. Another reason that caste has passed underneath the radar of international scrutiny is because by force-fitting caste into a sort of reductive Marxist class analysis, many progressive Indian intellectuals, and there are many who are very, very well known, and for them, caste is just a footnote. You know, it isn't addressed as the engine that drives Indian society. It doesn't, they have not managed to develop the tools to explain caste. And sometimes that erasure is a political act, you know, that kind of what I call the project of unseeing. And sometimes it just comes from a place of such privilege that people just assume that it doesn't exist because they only exist amongst the elite and they haven't stumbled on caste, not even in the dark. So you can have books written about identity and justice and reason and not even mention caste, development, all of this. Now, I don't want to kind of, rain down statistics on your head, but I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of how caste, global capital, people argue that global capital and this kind of free market loving democracy that India has broken down old networks and created new systems and hierarchies that have broken caste. But in fact, if you look at it, the opposite is true, that this new free market democracy has entrenched and modernized caste. I mean, I can tell you from every angle how that has happened. It's all in the book, but I'll just give you a brief example. For example, the whole world knew when the big protests happened in 2012 on the Delhi gang rape and murder. But you would be shouted down on an Indian television channel if you mentioned that same year, 1,500 Dalit women were raped by upper caste men, by privileged caste men. And that's just about 10% of what actually happens because these rapes are not recorded. In 2012, 651 Dalits were killed in caste murders. If you look at who owns land, I'd say 90% of Dalits are landless. The statistics are all there, you know. If you look at almost any indicator of social justice, you see what's going on. But of course, academics and journalists and all of us, we do love NGOs, you know, everybody loves to study the poor. Very few like to study the rich. But if you look at what has happened in India recently, I mean, because of globalization, as we know, something like 800 million Indians live on less than $50 a day. And yet you have 100 people, just like in the United States, you have the 1%, 99% thing. But you look at that 1% and you see, if you look at who the billionaires in India are, they are almost all Baniyas who belong to that trader caste, Gandhi's caste. You know, their names are all down here. If you look at the corporations, they're all family owned, again owned by Baniyas. And they now, these few corporations, they own mines, they own petrochemicals, they own electricity distribution, they own ports, they own special economic zones, they own water, dams, publishing houses, universities. The spectrum of what they own is incredible. And then they own, like, for example, Reliance, the biggest corporation in India. It owns 27 fully 24-hour news channels. So they own the media. They own all these businesses. You know, there's this kind of full spectrum dominance. Baniyas are also the small shopkeepers. They're also the rural money lenders. And most of rural India is in the clutches of incredible debt. So the small percentage of the population controls the economy. Then if you look at which are the predominant castes in the judiciary, who are the editors, who are the big journalists, it's again Baniyas and Brahmins. So you have you have the situation where caste and capitalism have merged into this kind of deadly alloy, And even as, you know, parties that represent the lower castes rise, the real power has shifted into the hands of the corporations, which are controlled by these people. So this is the reason why, you know, speaking of this old conflict is so important. So as I said, in 1936 was the year when Ambedkar published the Annihilation of Caste. It was I think in 1935 that he first called on the untouchable population, which was about 44 million people at that time, to give up Hinduism and to embrace any other religion. And this, at that moment, came as a terribly dangerous sign to what were the Hindu reformers. And I'll explain why. You know, until the turn of the century, there wasn't such a thing, such an idea as Hindu. People who today are called Hindus or who call themselves Hindus never did call themselves Hindus. They only referred to themselves as their caste. You know, they would say, I'm a Brahmin, I'm a Jadhav, I'm a Gujjar. You know, everybody just identified themselves according to their caste name. And earlier on, during the Mughal reign, millions of untouchables had converted to Islam, later to Christianity, and later to Sikhism to escape the scourge of caste. And nobody had a problem with that. But at the turn of the century, suddenly the politics of empire began to turn into the politics of the nation state. And suddenly, you know, it was not enough to just ride your horse or your elephant into Delhi and take the throne and declare yourself the emperor. So with the nation state came the politics of representation. And here was a subcontinent where there were Sikhs and Christians and Jains and Buddhists and, you know, Brahmins and Vaishyas, people with so many religions, 3,000 languages. All of this was kind of now being synthetically homogenized into a nation state. And at that time, the politics of representation began. You know, who has the right to say, I represent everybody? You know, who represents the big farmers? Who represents the labor? Who represents the Sikhs? Who can say who represents whom? And at this point, suddenly the idea that 44 million people under the accounting head of Hindu might just move over onto another side created a tremendous anxiety. And this was when these sort of privileged caste Hindu reform organizations suddenly came into being, you know, the Arya Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj, the Ramakrishna Mission, and they started proselytizing amongst untouchables, and they started speaking against untouchability but not against caste. So, because the whole thing was to bring this huge population into the Hindu fold, but to keep them, somehow to keep them in the servants' quarters. So you had this privileged caste reform movement, and you had an anti-caste movement to the tradition to which Ambedkar belonged, which started off with Buddhism. You know, when Buddhism broke caste thousands of years ago. So you had, Ambedkar came from a long line, and his contemporaries were, I mean, I won't get into it here, but people like Jyotiba Phule and Periyar and Ayodhya Das, who were speaking against caste. And Gandhi came from the tradition of people who were speaking against untouchability, trying to bring them into the big fold. So that is why he had this really strange, performative, theatrical approach to reform. So when I started reading, when I read the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar in the Annihilation of Caste, I kind of started following this thread back of, you know, these things that Gandhi was saying about caste, it just shocked me, you know. And I've been brought up with the same kind of history textbooks about how he was in South Africa and he was thrown out of the train and he was so roused to, and he fought race. And I started following this thread back, saying, how could a man who was saying the things he was saying in 1936, in 1925, how did this man come to be called a Mahatma? Who called him a Mahatma? When was he called a Mahatma? And I find that he was first called a Mahatma in 1915, which was the year he came back after spending 20 years of political activism in South Africa. So then I thought, now what has he done in South Africa that made him a Mahatma there? And that became even more shocking than anything else, because Gandhi arrived in South Africa in 1894, and he arrived there as a lawyer, as a legal advisor to a rich Muslim businessman, Indian Muslim businessman. And at the time, Britain was kind of strengthening its imperial grip on Africa. They discovered diamonds and they had discovered all these minerals. And there were two kinds of Indians in South Africa at the time. There were the passenger Indians, who were the sort of privileged caste Indians who had gone to South Africa to trade, to run their businesses on the back of British imperialism. And then there were the indentured labor, the poor subordinated caste bonded laborers who had been brought to work the sugar plantations. So Gandhi's first political awakening, when he was on this train in this whites-only compartment and he was thrown out in Pietermaritzburg, was not because he believed in racial equality, but because, and he's written this, I would not presume to say any of this. All my research comes straight from the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. Everything I say is quoted directly from his own writings. So he actually was outraged that passenger Indians should be treated on par with what he called the raw Kafir. He only referred to Africans as Kafirs or savages. And I'll read out what he said. But his first political victory was in 1894 when he lobbied and won a solution, what was known as the solution to the problem of the Durban post office, where he had the authorities open a third entrance for Indians so that they would not have to share the same entrance as Africans. So that was the first victory. Then he started the Natal Indian Congress, to which the membership fee was £3. Many years later, in the Bambata uprising, the Zulu uprising, they rose up against the British because of a £3 tax. So you can imagine how exclusive this Natal Indian Congress was. And then in 1899, Gandhi keeps writing about how he's looking forward to an imperial brotherhood with the British, and how the passenger Indians are of Indo-Aryan stock, the same Aryan stock as the British. And then in 1899, when the British go to war, in this savage war against the Boers, Gandhi volunteers and sides with them. Of course, they don't give him arms, so he is a stretcher bearer. And I think quite soon you will read a book called The Stretcher Bearer of Empire that's coming out, written by a South African academic. So he joins the British in the Boer War. Then in 1906, he joins, let me just read you what Gandhi said about Indian bonded labor. He says, whether they are Hindus or Mohammedans, they are absolutely without any moral or religious instruction worthy of the name. They have not learned enough to educate themselves without any outside help. Placed thus, they are apt to yield to the slightest temptation to tell a lie, and after some time, lying with them becomes a habit and a disease. They would lie without any reason, without any prospect of bettering themselves materially. Indeed, without knowing what they are doing, they reach a stage in life when their moral faculties have completely collapsed. Now, this theme repeats itself I've quoted Gandhi from 1894 to 1946, right to the end of his life. So the business of his changing, the business of, oh, he was a man of his times, is addressed in this work, because you can either be a man of your times or you can be a Mahatma. You really can't be both. And anyway, then in 1906, the Zulu chief Bambata Kamachinza led his people in an uprising against the British. And Gandhi volunteers his services. He asks to be armed with weapons, but the British turn him down. And eventually, it was a massacre. The chief, Bambata, was beheaded. Thousands of Zulus were killed. Even Churchill, the master of war, was shocked and wrote these letters saying, how can we be so brutal? But Gandhi continued to press his friendship on the British. And then in 1906, the British, despite these offers of friendship, passed an act which disallowed the passenger Indians from going into the Transvaal to compete with British businessmen. So that was the time when Gandhi started developing the methods of satyagraha. Now the thing is that I don't think we should just look at all of this as saying, oh, are you trying to say that satyagraha is a bad thing? No, I'm not trying to say that, but I'm just trying to tell you the context in which this kind of politics arose. So, he had by then been given a huge farm by a German friend of his called Kallenbach. It was like a 1,000-acre fruit farm on which he started this ashram, and he started experimenting with the rituals of poverty and pure. It was very much based in caste, purity and pollution. He kept talking about how a satyagrahi has to be pure, he has to be vegetarian, he mustn't have sex, and all this kind of stuff started there. And he was thrown into prison, and this time the man who couldn't bear to enter a post office door, share a post office entrance with an African, had to now share a prison cell. And there's a series of letters he writes about this. He begins a campaign saying that Indians and Africans must have separate cells, separate food, separate bathrooms. And here just one of these many letters. We were all prepared for hardships, but not quite for this experience. We could understand not being classed with the whites, but to be placed on the same level with the natives seemed to be too much to put up with. I then felt that Indians had not launched our passive resistance too soon. Here was further proof that the obnoxious law was meant to emasculate Indians. Apart from whether or not this implies degradation, I must say it's rather dangerous. Kafirs, as a rule, are uncivilized. The convicts even more so. They are troublesome and very dirty and live almost like animals. So this kind of thing goes on, and then these rituals of poverty start to be developed in the Tolstoy farm. And the question is, when you're enacting poverty, there is, according to me, poverty is not just about having no money, right? Poverty is about having no power. And here was a person who was accumulating power, but performing the rituals of poverty. So while Gandhi was taking off his suit and putting on the loincloth, Ambedkar, a man who was born in an untouchable family, who was not allowed to wear clothes, was putting on a suit. Which was the more radical act, is a question we have to ask ourselves. But it was only in 1913, which was his last year in South Africa, that Gandhi actually stepped out from this privileged, agitation. You're performing the rituals of poverty, you're developing satyagraha. What are you fighting for? Not for the indentured worker, not for the colonized African, not for higher wages, not for justice, but for the right of the Indian businessman to expand his business into the Transvaal. You know, it's a real irony. And it's only in 1913, his last year in South Africa, that actually Gandhi stepped out to join the workers' strikes, the coal workers' strikes, the Indian indentured labor strike. But very quickly, he signs a deal with Jan Smuts and leaves South Africa that very year. The Year of Blood, South African Year of Blood, it was called. And it is around that time that Gandhi's sort of semi-commissioned biographies begin to be written. And all of them are written by Christian missionaries. All of them start calling him the living Christ, the savior of the poor, and so on, when actually it was just the opposite, you know. So you all remember Reverend Charlie Andrews from the Attenborough film. He came to South Africa and fell on his knees and said that Gandhi was the living avatar of Christ. In 1921, the Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes of the Community Church in New York, in a sermon called "Who is the Greatest Man in the World?" introduced Gandhi to his congregation as the suffering Christ of the 20th century. And much later, in 1958, Martin Luther King Jr. said Christ furnished the spirit and motivation while Gandhi furnished the method. And they actually presented Gandhi with a constituency of African Americans, a great irony because he had great contempt for Africans. And Martin Luther King actually, in a sense, was more Gandhian than Gandhi. I mean, he led a sanitation workers' strike, but Gandhi said for sweepers to go on strike was a sin, you know. So and anyway, he leaves South Africa in 1913, goes to England, where he is given the highest civilian award of Imperial Britain, the Kaiser-e-Hind. And then he arrives in India. Somewhere on the high seas, the wind bestows him the title of the Mahatma, who fought racism and who fought for justice and who fought for equality. And he arrives on the shores of India as a Mahatma. And who greets him? The biggest industrialists in India, the Birlas, the biggest mill owners. They greet him, they take him from city to city, they embrace him, they fund his ashram. And there was born the first, perhaps the greatest, perhaps never to be repeated, the greatest corporate-funded NGO the world has known. That was where it began. And Gandhi, at that time when he arrives, the mill owners have made money during the war, but the mill workers are on strike. There are these lightning strikes happening, and the mill owners call Gandhi in to negotiate with the workers. And he starts, not a union, it's an association. And the first condition is that they will not represent themselves. He will represent them. Gandhi will represent them. And this is the man who Ambedkar, who at the time Gandhi was coming to India, Ambedkar was actually leaving for Columbia. He studied in Columbia. He got a scholarship to study in Columbia, and this is the man that he presumed to argue with. So Ambedkar, of course, did not have to go all the way to South Africa to experience injustice. As I said, he was born in a Mahar family, and because of British legislation, an untouchable boy was allowed to attend a touchable school. But this man, this greatest, I think one of the greatest Indian intellectuals, was made to sit on a gunny sack in the corner of the classroom so that he would not pollute the other privileged caste children. Then his family moves to Bombay and he gets a scholarship, finally graduates. He gets a scholarship by the Maharaja of Baroda to come to Columbia, where he studies and writes this brilliant paper about caste. He's 25 years old, and then comes back to India, to Baroda. Around the same time, Gandhi's star is rising, and Ambedkar, to work off his scholarship, has to go to Baroda to work. And the boy who studies in Columbia, who sits at table with everyone else, who studies in the library, who eats at the dining table, now goes to office and the clerks are throwing files at him. They're rolling up the carpet so his feet won't pollute the carpet in the office. he cannot find a place to live. He cannot, neither Hindus, nor Muslims, nor Christians, nor Parsis will allow an untouchable into their house. So eventually, he moves back to Bombay. And at this time is when this whole business of bringing the untouchables into the Hindu fold is at its peak. And Ambedkar sees right through this charade. You know, he sees that it's all a way of manipulating the privileged caste, manipulating to control and represent this huge constituency. So he begins to first he starts newspapers. He was the editor of several newspapers. And most important, he starts thinking, he has studied law, he's an economist, he's a philosopher, and he starts developing legally and politically a way of trying to lobby for the untouchable people to represent themselves. You see, because if you look at the way populations are scattered, they're always on the edges of villages and so on, so they can never form a political constituency. They're always the minority. So he's developing a way, trying to think of a way of how they could become a political constituency. And this is what Gandhi and the other privileged caste reformers just don't want. And this is what Gandhi stakes his life on to destroy. And it is this battle of political representation that is at the core of the conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar. So, you know, as I don't have time to get into everything, but you all have heard of the salt satyagraha. Of course, it was a fantastic, imaginative political campaign by Gandhi in 1930 when he called upon the people of India to march to the sea and make salt to break the British salt tax. That was in 1930. In 1927, Ambedkar led a satyagraha which not just you but most Indians have never heard of. It was called the Mahad Satyagraha, when tens of thousands of Dalits gathered in the small village, the town of Mahad in what is now Maharashtra. And they marched through the town to insist that Dalits should be allowed to drink water from a public tank, which they were disallowed from, but which some British legislation had actually made legal, but people were too scared to actually test it out. So they did the Mahad Satyagraha in 1927. There were two, one and then another, but I'm just going to collate them. So they marched through the town, they drank water. The Brahmins purified the tank by pouring cow dung into it, you know. And what did Gandhi do? Gandhi did not support the Mahad Satyagraha. That same year, speaking in Lahore at a meeting, he said, you know, untouchables should try to get their way by sweet persuasion, because when they do satyagraha, it actually amounts to duragraha, which he defined as a devilish force, you know. So between salt and water, there was a toxic universe of politics in India. Now, in 1930 was the first roundtable conference where the British government called this conference in order to kind of devise a constitution for home rule. So you had Muslim representatives, Sikh representatives, Christian representatives, and for the first time, the untouchables, represented by Dr. Ambedkar, went to London. The Congress Party, which was a party really run by privileged caste Hindus, Brahmins and Banyas, they were boycotting it because that was the time of the salt satyagraha. And that was when Ambedkar developed this really brilliant proposal for the double vote. You know, so he said that untouchable people should be allowed to vote for their own representative, and then they should be given another vote to vote for a general representative for a period of 10 years until they can develop themselves into a constituency. And the British and everyone else there accepted that. But, of course, the roundtable conference ended. And then there was a second roundtable conference in 1931, when Gandhi was nominated by the Congress to go and represent them. And it was at that conference that Ambedkar and Gandhi had their first confrontation. And before the official confrontation, Gandhi met Ambedkar, and he just looked at this really erudite, sharp young man and assumed he was a Brahmin, and whatever, a self-hating Brahmin. And he said, he questioned him about Ambedkar's already vociferous critique of the Congress party, which, according to Gandhi, amounted to a critique of the homeland. And there's this poignant moment when Ambedkar looked at him and said, Gandhiji, I have no homeland. No untouchable worth his name would think of this as his homeland. And then at the conference, which went on for several weeks, this confrontation began, where Gandhi said, I, in myself, in my own person, represent India's 44 million untouchables. And he refused to acknowledge that Ambedkar could have a voice or could ask for this separate constituency. He was all right. Gandhi agreed about the Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, that was okay, but no, the untouchables will not have a separate constituency. He said, I would rather Hinduism died than untouchability survived, which was again fancy footwork. I want to read to you a part about caste and entitlement, which I think will have a resonance here. See, because what was the caste system? How was caste maintained? How can a system of such immutable hierarchy be maintained? How do landlords force laborers generation after generation to toil night and day on subsistence wages? Why would an untouchable laborer who is not allowed to even dream of being a landowner one day put his or her life at the landlord's disposal to plow the land, to sow seed and harvest crop, if it were not out of the sheer terror of the punishment that awaits the wayward? How were African slaves forced to work on American cotton fields? By being lynched and hung from trees for others to see and be afraid. Why are the murders of insubordinate Dalits even today never simply murders but ritual slaughter? Why are they always burnt alive, raped, dismembered, and paraded naked? Because casteism, like racism, and this is true of racism today in America, it can only be maintained with the continuous threat of and the regular application of egregious violence. So the question is, what does it mean for a doctrine of nonviolence to be founded on a base of egregious violence? What kind of nonviolence is that, is the question. And at the roundtable conference, Gandhi just said, you cannot represent yourself. And then he threatened them. He said, look, I will give up my life for this, but this can't happen. And he just took the boat back to India. On the way, he stopped by, dropped in on Mussolini, went back and wrote about what a nice man he was. No, I'm serious. He did. And then, so here, sorry to go back a bit in time, but so you have this hardening of this idea of the Hindu. As I said earlier, there wasn't any such thing as a Hindu. There were just these various castes and subcastes. And suddenly when people started calling themselves Hindu, it wasn't actually referring to their religion. It was the creation of a political constituency. So they're always talking about the Hindu nation or the Hindu race. And around 1925 came the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which later on became overtly fascist, which said that and today says that the Muslims of India are like the Jews of Germany. Hitler is in their pantheon. Our Prime Minister today is a member of the RSS, as so are all his ministers. So that school of Hindu fascism had already arrived. And Ambedkar, he just considered them outside the pale. So his argument was directed at the Hindu liberal, people like Gandhi. And he said that it's not possible to believe in the Shastras and call yourself a moderate at the same time. It's a contradiction in terms. So these are the two men now confronting each other. And Gandhi returns to India. And the British announced the Communal Award, which is known as the Communal Award, where they do allow the untouchables a separate electorate for 20 years so that they can develop into what Ambedkar wanted. And Gandhi's response was to go on an indefinite hunger strike. You know, he never went on any hunger strike on any issue about untouchability except this one, to destroy the possibility of untouchable folks representing themselves. And when he announced this indefinite hunger strike from prison, there was obviously the country went into a spin, and all the great leaders descended on Ambedkar, and including many other untouchable leaders who grew very frightened, because if Gandhi died on that hunger strike, you know, the untouchable community was going to be lynched. So there was an incredible amount of pressure, and it was really a terrible moment for Ambedkar, and he had to back down. In the face of that pressure, he had to back down, and he signed he agreed to sign what is known as the Pune Pact. Of course, in the Round Table Conference, Gandhi refused to admit that he was a leader of the untouchables, but in the Pune Pact, he said Ambedkar will sign as the representative of the untouchables. And Gandhi himself didn't sign it, but various industrialists and Hindu right-wing people signed it. And in the Pune Pact, what happened was, instead of having a separate constituency, they said that they would have reserved seats for untouchables, but that meant that those who stood for elections would be approved by the privileged caste. So they had to be well-behaved people, you know, the house niggers, as Malcolm X would have called them. So this was the situation in 1932, and Ambedkar just and as soon as the Pune Pact was signed, if you look at the Attenborough film, you see, you know, the world rejoiced as if caste had been broken, when in fact what had happened was that the possibility of untouchables in India developing into a constituency had been broken. And Gandhi then embarked on various sort of reformist measures, because, you know, what he did and what many of the reformers did was to reduce the whole question of entitlement and caste to the issue of untouchability. Then Gandhi reduced it further to the issue of bhangis. Bhangis is what he used to call scavengers, and they are called Valmikis today. And Gandhi just used them as a sort of show window on which he just performed his amazing acts of, you know, missionary goodness. And in 1936, when Ambedkar wrote The Annihilation of Caste, which I hope you will all read, it's a really brilliant, erudite document. Gandhi wrote an essay which I have to read to you. It'll take me 2 minutes. It was called The Ideal Bhangi. And he says, the Brahmin's duty is to look after the sanitation of the soul. The Bhangi is that of the body of society. And yet our woe-begone Indian society has branded the Bhangi as a social pariah and set him down at the bottom of the scale. If only we had given him due recognition, if we only had given due recognition to the status of the Bhangi as equal to the Brahmin, our villages would have looked a picture of cleanliness and order. I therefore make bold to state, without any manner of hesitation or doubt, that not till the invidious distinction between Brahmin and Bhangi is removed will our society enjoy health and prosperity. Then he goes on to outline the educational requirements and practical skills and etiquette of an ideal Bhangi. What qualities, I quote, what qualities therefore should such an honored servant of society exemplify in his person? In my opinion, an ideal Bhangi should have a thorough knowledge of the principles of sanitation. He should know how a right kind of latrine is constructed and the correct way of cleaning it. He should know how to overcome and destroy the odor of excreta and various disinfectants to render them innocuous. He should likewise know the process of converting urine and night soil into manure. But that's not all. My ideal Bhangi would know the quality of night soil and urine and would keep a close watch on those and give timely warning to the individual concerned. Now, an ancient text called the Manusmriti says, that Shudras should not amass wealth. So Gandhi in his ideal Bhangi says, but such an ideal Bhangi, while deriving his livelihood from his occupation, would approach it only as a sacred duty and would not dream of amassing wealth out of it. Now, 70 years later, in his book Karma Yogi, Narendra Modi, the new Prime Minister of India, proved he was a diligent disciple of the Mahatma. All Modi's pronouncements were, when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, were delivered from the Mahatma Mandir. And, while the left often thinks of Gandhi as a bulwark between the right, Hindu right, and moderation, actually, particularly on the issue of caste, Gandhi was the Hindu right. So here is Narendra Modi on Valmikis or scavengers. As you know, after a rock concert in Madison Square Garden, he came out and spoke about global hygiene like all good fascists. I do not believe, this is Narendra Modi, I do not believe that the Valmikis have been doing this job just to sustain their livelihood. Had this been so, they would not have continued with this kind of job generation after generation. At some point of time, somebody must have got the enlightenment that it is the Valmiki's duty to work for the happiness of the entire society and the gods, and that they have to do this job bestowed upon them by the gods, and this job should continue as internal spiritual activity for centuries. On the October 2nd was Gandhi Jayanti, and it has never been celebrated with so much fervor as when Narendra Modi came to power. And he told all government officers who normally get a holiday on that day that they must go to work and clean their toilets. The subtext is just clean your toilet once a year and let someone else do it for you the rest of the time. And then he went to the Bhangis, of course, the Valmikis as they're called, they also live in a segregated settlement in every city. They are not allowed to live, with other people. But Modi said that now he was going to be an ideal Bhangi and he was going to go and clean the streets. And I've forgotten to get you the newspaper clipping, but what happened was, first, the Valmikis were made to clean the streets and to just leave a few leaves there for Modi to clean. Then they were locked into their colony while Modi came and in his spotless white clothes and cleaned those leaves and drove away. So this is, the performance of fascism, really. Anyway, so after the Round Table Conference, Gandhi then began working in what is called the Temple Entry movement. He was trying to bring the untouchable community closer and closer to Hinduism, while Ambedkar was struggling against this. And it was really tragic after that, because by the time the 40s approached, the whole emphasis changed to the conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and that became the battleground. And the Congress party managed to use untouchables who were impressed by Gandhi's missionary activities, which, having faced so much cruelty, was seductive in some ways. And they began to be used as the outlying army in the battle of partition, where, as you all know, more than 1 million people, Hindus and Muslims, massacred each other. And Pakistan, the land of the pure, the first Islamic republic, was born. But even in the middle of all that chaos and all that violence and all that bloodshed, the Pakistani government managed to declare that Valmikis who lived in Pakistan were essential commodities, and who else was going to clean the shit in the land of the pure? Because in the subcontinent, Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs all practice untouchability. And in what happened as partition came, as it became clear the British were leaving, Gandhi sort of began to withdraw from the business of the state. And he said that, look, quite rightly, he said that the state is the embodiment of all violence. And I believe in the rule of the people, and so on. Now, Ambedkar grew terrified of this. For him, the rule of the people was going to be the rule of the Hindu privileged caste. So he was desperate to try and get whatever safeguards he could in place, which is why he lobbied, and it's a complicated story of how he came to be on the drafting committee of the Constitution, where he did manage to put in some safeguards, though he became very, very unhappy about what form the Constitution finally took. And he said, that I believe that every generation should have a new Constitution. But then he became India's first law minister, because he was really the only person who was equipped to. He had been working on these issues for so long. And as the first law minister, he said, he believed that caste was controlled through women. And he tried to change the Hindu Code Bill to bring in laws on divorce, to give women rights to inheritance. The parliament was surrounded by right-wing Hindus, sadhus. He finally resigned in disgust. But today, when you see the statues of Ambedkar, they hold up the Constitution, which is a document that he himself was pretty unhappy with, not the Annihilation of Caste, which was Ambedkar the revolutionary. So Ambedkar actually was quite nimble in his movement over the lines, to try to get what he could. And yet, sometimes he's frozen as the writer of the Constitution, and people get stuck in constitutionalism, and therefore the issue of caste has just become a maze of difficulties. I have not spoken at all about Ambedkar's relationship with the left, with the communist movement, which ended in a terrible tragedy, because he believed that Brahmanism, which was really the anti-caste movement for Hinduism, Brahmanism and capitalism were the real enemies of the people. But communists in India, people of the book, therefore people of the privileged caste, simply could not understand what it meant to be an untouchable or a lower caste. And all the leaders, even today, of the communist movement are predominantly of the privileged castes. And there was a huge falling out between union leaders and Ambedkar. And he says in the Annihilation of Caste that caste is not just a division of labor, but a division of laborers. So eventually, watching the way Gandhi managed to manipulate untouchable people, get them back into the Hindu fold, Ambedkar realized, he was a man who believed in rationalism, in Western liberalism. I haven't spoken at all about, the way Gandhi's suspicion and prophetic understanding, I'd say, of the seed of cataclysm in modern capitalism made him romanticize this very brutal past. And Ambedkar's horror of the brutal past made him embrace Western liberalism for a while, which was catastrophic. But later, towards the end of his life, just a few months before he died, he embraced Buddhism. But even there, it was his own kind of Buddhism, which he developed, his own understanding of it. But he wrote a famous text called The Buddha and His Dhamma, but he didn't have the money to publish it. Nobody in the government would help him publish it. So he died a very tragic figure. He wore suits, yes, but he died in debt. whereas Gandhi wore a loincloth, but he died in the house of a big industrialist. So where does that leave us, the rest of us in India? Though they call the age we are living through the Kali Yuga, the dark age, where caste has supposed to have been ended, meaning for them it's the dark age when caste ends. Varnashram dharma actually reigns unchallenged. The Brahmin largely continues to control knowledge. The Baniya dominates the economy, big and small. The Kshatriyas have seen better days, but are still for the most part rural landowners. The Shudras live in the basement of the big house and keep intruders at bay. The indigenous people, who I haven't even spoken about because I've written so much about them in my past work, are fighting for their very survival. And the Dalits, well, we've been through all that. There has not been a day in India since 1947, not a single day in India, when the Indian army has not been deployed within its own borders against, quote unquote, its own people. And if you look at where that army has been deployed, Manipur, Nagaland, Assam, Mizoram, Kashmir, Junagadh, Hyderabad, Goa, Punjab, and now shortly against the poorest people, the indigenous people in central India, you see that the enemy has always been tribals, Christians, Sikhs, Muslims, Dalits. In its DNA, it continues to be an upper caste state, a privileged caste state at war and controlling the others. So can caste be annihilated? Well, not unless we show the courage to rearrange the stars in our firmament, not unless those who call themselves revolutionary develop a radical critique of the caste system, and not unless those who understand caste sharpen their critique of capitalism, and not unless we read Baba Saheb Ambedkar, if not inside our classrooms, then outside them, and until then we will remain what he called the sick men and women of Hindustan who seem to have no desire to get well. Thank you.
There's around 87 great questions here. And in the interest of allowing time for signing and some personal interaction, we're not going to nearly get to all of them. But I'm gonna leave these here for you to start. I'm gonna go back and get a little thing that I'm gonna read out in a moment for announcement in the audience. But Arundhati can dive right in.
Okay, this is good. How is caste articulated in Bollywood films, whether in contemporary or period films? You know, there are a few films, very, very few films, you can count them on your fingertips, that have dealt with caste. I mean, one very good film is a film called Fandri, which I don't think it's a Bollywood film, but it's a new film, and it deals with caste in a beautiful way. But for the most part, it's just ignored. It's just as if it doesn't exist. Bollywood films are interesting, you know, where we live in a society of caste, where even today, I live in Delhi, and in Delhi, in the outskirts of Delhi, continuously people are being lynched, killed, beheaded, boys and girls who marry across caste lines. It just happens almost every day. You read it in the papers. Very few people marry outside caste. Most marriages are arranged, and yet Bollywood films are all about love. You know, so it's like this fantasy that everybody likes to go and see in the movies, but it doesn't really play out in real life. So yeah, I mean, it's an absence for the most part. What role do you think NGOs and international development agencies play in solidifying or dismantling caste? You know, this is a very important question. I don't know whether I can, have enough time to answer it. But because I've written quite a lot about NGOs and the role they play, in furthering the imperial economic agenda. And when you look at NGOs, when I say NGOs, I mean also the foundations, the Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, and their equivalents, and how they have actually, on the face of it, it's not like everything that they do is bad. But what happens is, if you look at, for instance, even look here in America at what these corporations have done to the memory of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a critic of the free market. He was talking about, he was not only talking about race, he was also talking about economic injustice, which is intrinsically linked to racial injustice. But today, if you look at who are the sponsors of the Martin Luther King Foundation, and you'll find there are lectures in his memory about the free market and so on. So how was the civil rights movement here, the radical end of it, subverted? How was the anti-apartheid movement subverted? How did it happen and unfold in Indonesia? All in all of Latin America, And similarly, what happens is, I won't speak specifically about caste, but let me talk about everything in India right now at the moment. What happens is the NGOs move in, and they start creating these silos, where there's a kind of, where everything becomes an identity, not just caste, feminism, poverty even is an identity, it's not something that's caused. And then all of these silos separate themselves from each other, and they work as a firewall against anything that's questioning in a serious way the economic imperialism. And the failure of the left is that it has allowed them the space to do this by not being able to address these questions, the questions of women, the question of caste, the question of race. The left has not been able to deal with it, so others have moved in and created these safe spaces where some of the grievances are addressed, but the rest are just left. They actually work as a firewall to perpetuate a system that is causing the problem in the first place. So, that's a short answer to a very complex question.
I'll give you some more questions.
Oh, go
I'm going to read out Bishu's.
Let's publish them as a book.
That's me. But just really quickly, some of the folks who are involved in organizing tonight asked that I read this. Various organizations in the United States, most prominently Ambedkar International Mission, AIM, and the Gadar Alliance, are in the early stages of designing a long-term campaign aimed at changing the public profile of how caste is understood in the United States, especially by liberal institutions and think tanks, academic institutions, and policymakers. It's going to be a multi-dimensional campaign that will involve creating targeted media outputs, reports, educational programming, and a series of short campaigns with specific, very tangible goals. If there are folks here tonight who are interested in helping build such a campaign or lend their support in other ways, please see Biju or Vinaya at the back of the hall. And maybe Biju, you could just, and Vinaya, raise your hand, and Vinaya. So see them after if you're interested in that particular project.
Okay, I'm going to just take 3 questions. One is there any criticism of the doctor? Yes, in fact, there is in the book, and it has to do with his attitude towards the indigenous people, who, within the Annihilation of Caste, his understanding of indigenous people, again, as savages and habitual criminals. And finally, when the Constitution was made, there were 2 categories of indigenous people, like Schedule 6 and Schedule 5. Schedule 6 was the northeastern states, where actually the Constitution stood them in good stead. But in the central Indian tribal areas, the homelands were once again given over to the state. And those people were criminalized overnight by the Constitution. This was not just Dr. Ambedkar, but that was how the Constitution came. Anyway, there is a detailed criticism. I have to say that, this book is not a hagiography of one and a demonization of the other. It's just that I was pushing against what people normally think, so I might have made it sound that way, but, you'll see when you read it. How was your book received in India? What were the impacts, debates, and rejection? Well, obviously, it was received in very complicated ways in India because, it is a subject that is extremely, extremely, extremely sensitive. There were some people who said, no non-Dalit has a right to write an introduction to Dr. Ambedkar's work. There were people who were annoyed that I had written so much about Gandhi. I can understand that, but it's just that I felt that he had made such a smoke screen that until you deconstructed him, you couldn't see the clarity of Annihilation of Caste. And as I said, if the book was published separately, it would have been banned. So it was a strategic thing. I mean, obviously there's no perfect text and so on. Then recently I spoke in my home state of Kerala at the Ayyankali Memorial Lecture. Ayyankali was again an untouchable in Kerala, Pulaya, amazing man who really led the first agricultural workers' strike before the Russian Revolution and so on. And there, I was really attacked by the Gandhians, and there was a threat of police cases. There were marches against me. The Home Secretary said I must apologize for all the things that I had said about Gandhi. I said, I haven't said anything about Gandhi. I can apologize for quoting him. So there was that. And the last question is, it's been said that sexual repression is the basis of sexual violence. Can you tell us about Gandhi's sexual repression, how he blamed victims of sexual violence for bringing violence on themselves, and discuss how he cut off the hair of young women followers? Can you talk about this? Yeah, well, look, this is a whole separate book, Gandhi and Women. It's really again, this whole thing is hidden in plain sight. People say, why did you call it the doctor and the saint? Why didn't you call it the doctor and the hypocrite? I said, Gandhi was not a hypocrite. He put it all down there. He wrote it down, The hypocrisy is in the way he has been edited and passed down to us, by the court historians of our times. But there is a part in this book where I talk about Gandhi when he first was on Tolstoy farm in South Africa, and he writes about how he had these young children living together, and he sent them to have a bath at the well, and he had told them very, very, very sternly about the wickedness that creeps into the minds of young boys and girls, and they must watch out for it. But then he says, the news I had been dreading came to me that some boy had made a joke about a girl, and he couldn't sleep all night wondering what he should do about it. And he called the girls and he said, what is it about you that made these people have these impure thoughts? And what can you do to yourself to prevent them from having these thoughts? And finally, he decided to shave off the hair. And he shaved off the hair. And then, of course, this was in South Africa. By the time he was 70, he was experimenting with his own, his sexuality. Like, how has he conquered sexual desire? And his experiment involved sleeping naked with his 17-year-old grandniece and her friend on either side of him. And, I just think that, first of all, who gets turned on by the grandniece? Second of all, what kind of person is it who thinks that one physical specimen of a woman is as good as the next and the next and the next? I mean, it's a really terrifying thing. And his constant his constant the things he said to women who were raped, and this theme remains. Gandhi liked to say that he was inconsistent, that consistency was the goblin of little minds, and that he grew from truth to truth. But truly, the fact is that he was remarkably consistent. If you look at his views on Africans, on workers, on women, and on the subordinate castes, I mean, even right up to 1946, there's a conversation in this book I have reproduced where he's talking to a American missionary and trying to say that it's not right of him to try and convert Dalits to Christianity. And he says, would you preach the gospel to a cow? Some of these untouchables have no more intelligence than a cow. So how has he come to be the saint that we think he is? Who made him that? This is the tragedy of our times, really. How have we allowed this to go on and on and on? And the price is being paid by the victims of the caste system in India. It's just shocking. Thank you.